Okay, and hello everyone. Happy Halloween. It's finally starting to feel like fall here in New England. It's been quite warm in the early months of the fall. Maybe this is a sign of things to come. But right now we're here to talk about Chapter 11, The Triumphs and Travails of the Jeffersonian Republic. Chapter 11 begins with a discussion of the Revolution of 1800, and I think that I see some similarities between this and other events in the chapter, such as the War of 1812. In both cases, the United States is able to demonstrate to the rest of the world that they should be taken seriously. So when Jefferson wins with Burr as his vice president, this is the first time that the existing party, the Federalists, were actually defeated. And this, of course, happens in a peaceful fashion. So it shows that this Republican experiment can, in fact, work. The election of 1800 also seems to be groundbreaking in that it's a very organized campaign. The pageant tells us that the Federalists present themselves in favor of order and a strong central government, whereas the Democratic Republicans see themselves as protectors, guardians of the agrarian purity and of states' rights. So a modern political campaign needs some mudslinging, and that seemed to be pretty common in the election of 1800. Actually, Alexander Hamilton criticized John Adams. He did this anonymously. Unfortunately for him, the Jeffersonians found it and published it as quickly as they could. Jefferson, in this whispering campaign, had plenty of rumors going around about him and his character, and many people attacked his faith. They probably falsely called him an atheist. He probably would have seen himself as a deist. And while deism is not really easy to define, I'll share a definition that David L. Holmes used in his Religion of the Founding Fathers. He cited one clergyman who said that deism is what is left of Christianity after casting off everything that is peculiar to it. The deist is one who denies the divinity, the incarnation, and the atonement of Christ, and the work of the Holy Ghost, who denies the God of Israel and believes in the God of nature. And I can't really say exactly what a deist is, but I can tell you that they did believe in a God or some form of God, and many of them actually attended Christian churches on Sundays. So, of course, this is a bit of an exaggeration, but it was something that people just couldn't really agree with. On top of that, it was reported that he had illegitimate children with one of his slaves. We now know that is most likely true, and in fact, the rumor went around that he had robbed a widow of her children and of a trust fund. One of the problems that I have with calling it the Revolution of 1800 is that when Jefferson's first elected, there is no real significant radical change. In fact, he does do away with some patronage, but he basically keeps Hamilton's financial plan intact. Now, he does remove the excise tax, which would have been more directly affecting farmers on the frontier, who, of course, would have been Jeffersonian Republicans, or Democratic Republicans, we should say. But he doesn't necessarily tear down the whole system. And that may be because the election was close. The pageant tells us that Jefferson won, I think, 73 to 64 in the Electoral College. But it also could be that Jefferson realized that his liberal ideas and philosophy books were better suited for the library than for public office. He certainly doesn't abandon his ideals. He tells us in his inaugural that the majority will decide the course, but pledges that the minority will never be oppressed. But he also sort of extends an olive branch in saying that we are all Republicans and we are all Federalists. Well, I just applauded Jefferson for not jumping too far to his end of the political spectrum, but we should give the Federalists some credit as well, as they're able to prevent the pendulum from swinging too far away from them. So how do they do that? Well, they entrench themselves into the Supreme Court. Now, we should get back to John Adams at the last days of his presidency, in which he appoints the famed midnight judges, these last-minute appointments that were done in what we would now call his lame duck period. And we'll talk about these judges some more with Marbury versus Madison, but for the meantime, we should realize that Chief Justice John Marshall will take the bench. And every single source I looked at in preparing for this chapter said the same thing. Yeah, he served a long time, and what did he do? If you see him on the test, he increased the power of the federal government. And so he represents a stronger centralized government, and he makes the Supreme Court an equal branch of the government. This is my favorite portrait of him. So how does John Marshall strengthen centralized government? Well, he creates and establishes this principle of judicial review. And so we see this with the court case of Marbury versus Madison in 1803. One of the midnight judges was William Marbury, and he did not receive his papers from James Madison, who was Jefferson's Secretary of State. In fact, Madison refused to deliver those papers. So this goes to the court, and the court rules that, well, Marbury is entitled to his papers, but also states that the court cannot enforce that policy. In a sense, Marshall is declaring that the Judiciary Act of 1789 is unconstitutional. And so this concept of judicial review establishes the Supreme Court as the sole interpreter of the Constitution, and it sets the precedent that the Supreme Court can declare laws unconstitutional, again, effectively making the Supreme Court an equal branch of government. Now, Republicans are furious and trying to get back at the Federalists. They impeached Samuel Chase. It was said that he was loose with his lips and unpopular. The House impeached, but the Senate found him not guilty of high crimes. It seems as though that he was disliked, and so it's significant that judges are not necessarily being attacked based on their character. It gives faith to judges and to the law. So Jefferson is not necessarily eager for any war, but he is faced with the issue of the pirates in the Mediterranean. And so these pirates were demanding that Jefferson continue to pay bribes that the previous administration was paying, but unfortunately for them, he just wasn't having it. So he sends a navy to the Mediterranean, and after roughly 4 years of fighting, secures a victory. He still does pay a ransom of $60,000 for the Americans captured, and I honestly don't know how that equates to the demanded ransom, but nonetheless, it does show that the United States is willing to engage in some sort of military conflict to defend itself, and I think that's very significant. It occurs here in Tripoli, as you can see, and that, of course, is the place that is referenced in the Battle Hymn of the Republic. On to Louisiana, right? Well, you might recall that Spain had granted the U.S. the right of deposit under Pinckney's treaty, but in 1802 they revoked that right, and apparently they were already in the deal, or negotiating the deal with Napoleon to transfer Louisiana to France. Napoleon on the frontier would have been a strong concern for anyone, obviously, but he's losing interest in it as the Haitian rebellion occurs. There's less of a need for New Orleans, which is supposed to supply Haiti with foodstuffs and so forth, and war is expensive, and so Napoleon has a few of those to pay for, and he decides it might be a good idea to sell this territory, which works out for the U.S. So we acquire over 800,000 square miles for roughly 3 cents an acre, and as the pageant tells us, we bought a wilderness to get a city. Again, New Orleans was a place where, crops and goods that are being transferred down the Mississippi can be stored until they're sent overseas, and so that's a pretty important location to have access to. And who's not concerned about Napoleon? So Jefferson knew that he didn't really have the authority to buy land, and in fact he felt this was unconstitutional. But as one of my favorite college professors, Richard Gerber, once said in class, like, who cares? I mean, do you want to give it back? And of course we all laugh and say no. But at the end of the day, this is going to be a positive move for the United States and a positive move for the Jefferson administration, in my opinion. Now, it is difficult for him to do this internally because he is, a proponent of strict interpretation. In fact, his chief opponent in Alexander Hamilton, right, was in favor of a more loose interpretation. So again, Jefferson's moving more towards the center on the political spectrum. Now, whether or not he intended to do that, I can't say, but ultimately the United States is doubled in size. After Louisiana is bought, it has to be explored. And of course, it's going to be Lewis and Clark and their Corps of Discovery that does that. And I just remember this story from such a young age, learning about Lewis and Clark in elementary school. And I like to think about why it is that these two and their adventure is actually taught. And I think it represents just a lot about the American spirit, and certainly the way that we look back at westward expansion and how it shaped the American character. The pageant tells us they have some conflict, but they get some help from Sacagawea or Sacagawea. We know that they reach the Pacific coast and they make it back, and they demonstrate that it's possible, in fact, to travel overland to the west. And that kind of opens the door for westward expansion and manifest destiny. It probably inspired many people to say, that they could do that they could, possess these, these characteristics of bravery and courage and perseverance and take advantage of what the West had to offer. Here's a map of their route. Okay, Aaron Burr, where do you start, right? Well, he's known for his planned secession of New England, and he's better known for his duel with Alexander Hamilton, in which he kills him. Now, Burr felt that his honor was at stake when Hamilton referred to him as despicable, and as a result of that, the two of them will meet in Weehawken, New Jersey in the summer of 1804. They stand at 10 paces and they fire 54 caliber pistols at one another. Now, you didn't necessarily have to kill a person like Burr did. In fact, you didn't actually have to fire your weapon, but this was an illegal way, but it was a way for gentlemen to demonstrate their honor and restore their honor. And I think it's interesting that Burr, who was so concerned with honor, actually continues to operate in a way that could be seen as dishonorable. In fact, he flees to the west and tries to incite another secession with General James Wilkinson until Wilkinson abandons Burr after it becomes known that Jefferson had caught wind of this. At that time, Burr is arrested and tried for treason, and fortunately for him, he's found not guilty because Chief Justice John Marshall insisted that there be proof of overt acts of treason as opposed to just treasonous intentions. So Burr is acquitted and he flees to Europe, and apparently he got right into the ear of Napoleon. Now, I was thinking about this, and I didn't really know what else I wanted to say, but I think it's kind of neat that you can see that the territory of the nation has gotten outside the reach of the federal government. And this is an ongoing issue, right? In cities in the late 19th century, criminals could commit a crime in one city and flee to another, and it's not until Tom Burns creates the Rogues Gallery that mugshots are available and people can be tracked, identities can be tracked. We have a similar issue today with cyber threats and identity theft and so forth, where people remotely can attack you and your finances and then sort of disappear. And Aaron Burr it seems as though he's doing this. Here's a new picture of Chief Justice John Marshall that I haven't shown you yet. Okay, so as I said before, Britain and France are at war with one another, and the United States will be swept up in the middle of this. Now, both countries did issue statements which assumed or asserted authority over American shipping, but the English went beyond that, and they also followed this practice of impressment. And so they begin to forcibly enlist American merchants and sailors into the British Navy, and obviously this is a concern for the United States and for American sailors, but it's not necessarily as clear, cut, and dry as we might make it out to be. Now, John Green, in his Crash Course History number 11, talks at length about how many of these sailors were in fact British and they had deserted to the American Navy. And he also goes on to talk about citizenship in the 19th century being much more loosely defined than it is today, especially true on the high seas. So incidents like the Chesapeake Affair or Chesapeake Incident can be used as a rallying cry, as a way to unite Americans and promote sort of a pro-war attitude, an anti-British attitude. And in fact, our book says that there was let out a roar of national wrath from infuriated Americans, but it may just not be as simple as we think it is. So, in response to these practices and things like the Chesapeake Affair, Jefferson issues the embargo. And you need to know the embargo failed, but I kind of like the idea of using an embargo. It was something that Americans were familiar with, something that had worked in the past. But as the pageant says, the United States had underestimated the determination of the British and, in fact, overestimated the demand for our goods in Europe. Okay, let's talk about the embargo. Well, in 1807, it actually cut off trade everywhere, and not just Britain and France. Now, the goal of the embargo was to get France and Britain to recognize and respect American rights, but at the end of the day, it had such a negative impact on the American economy that it really just made Jefferson very unpopular. Take New England, for example, which is not exactly pro-Jefferson to begin with. Now, if they're going to be doing the shipping, which is just not happening any longer, then they're not going to be building any more ships, and they're not going to be employing sailors, and they're not going to be selling insurance policy on cargoes, and they're not going to be very happy. Folks on the frontier who are these sort of small-time, farmers who would have supported Jefferson because of their political beliefs, they're also dependent upon the export market, and now they're going to be hit by this as well. We're going to take a look at different opinions of this embargo with this cartoon tomorrow in class. Obviously, it's revoked in 18... All right, so let's talk about the Non-Intercourse Act of 1809. Well, what did it do? Well, it kind of continued the embargo, but specifically only with Britain and France. And so that does open up trade and promote some positive economic growth, but unfortunately, the U.S. economy is still really heavily reliant on the trade with Britain and France, and so it doesn't really do enough positive good to the economic situation. But it does do some other things in terms of shifting or changing the American economy. And I love how the pageant presents this. It says something like how Jefferson probably inadvertently did more for the young industry of America than his outspoken Federalist opponent Hamilton ever did. Don't forget that Hamilton had a tariff as a part of his financial plan, and that sort of erected a thin wall around American industry. But particularly in New England, you're going to see this young industrial movement. If New England folks are not shipping goods any longer, they're going to use their Yankee ingenuity and find a new way to make money, and they do that in the factory setting. So Jefferson, who did believe agriculture would be the main industry, would be sort of like the social backbone for America, actually helped to spark or promote industrial growth. Okay, Macon's Bill number 2, or as its section heading in our textbook says, Madison's Gamble. So basically this was an attempt to get both Britain and France, or at least one of them, to remove their shipping restrictions on the United States. And what it said was that if one country agreed to remove their restrictions, that the U.S. would trade with them, obviously, but keep the embargo on the other side. And I suppose ultimately the U.S. would hope that both countries would remove restrictions and open up free trade and open trade and so forth. Well, the English are not really going to be on board with this, and while the French will agree, the English will not revoke their orders of council. Now, for a long time, their orders of council had been somewhat justified as retaliation to Napoleon's aggression. So by not lifting their orders of council, they're sort of making Napoleon appear to be more friendly. At some point in our book, they mention that there is a generational change, that the people who were involved in this phase of our country's history were not necessarily involved in the framing of the Constitution or the Revolution itself. And so on the left here, you can see Henry Clay of Kentucky, and on the right is John C. Calhoun of South Carolina. And obviously, these are not photos of them as younger men. I suppose I should have chosen photos of them as younger men to further illustrate this point. But they are going to be very vocal at this phase in American history. And they are new members of government from the South and the West, and they're very nationalistic, and they favor militarism, and they favor, or they're certainly in support of the government buying new land. They don't have a problem with removing Indians off of their land, and probably correctly so to some extent, they feel that any British or Spanish presence on the frontier, in fact, is detrimental to the country, as they're most likely inciting some sort of Indian resistance, whether they're arming them or paying them for scalps, as was suggested in previous chapters. All in all, they're just not a good group to be on the American border. Okay, so in terms of specific Native American resistance, we could look at Tecumseh and the Prophet, his younger brother, Tenskwatawa. And the two of them attempt to create a confederation of tribes that are remaining east of the Mississippi. Tenskwatawa is a prophet, as I said before, and he argues against assimilation. I know one of the things specifically he argues against is alcohol and the consumption of alcohol. And together they lead the Shawnee resistance to white settlement in the Northwest Territory. And here's Tecumseh. And so the Western Warhawks are pushing for war, and a battle will occur in 1811 at Tippecanoe. And William Henry Harrison leads this American force, and later in 1840 he actually uses this as part of the first presidential slogan of Tippecanoe and Tyler too. But Tecumseh himself was actually not present. The Prophet and his Shawnee warriors are defeated, and Tecumseh eventually will ally himself with the British in the War of 1812 and fight alongside them until he dies in 1813. But it is sort of the end of this hope for an Indian Confederacy. Okay, so shifting back to conflict with European powers, James Madison is in a position to lead the country into war, and in fact that's what he's going to do. Congress will obviously vote on this, and it is a pretty close vote to say the least. It's the first of, I think, 5 times that the U.S. Congress has voted for war, but in some ways Madison is appealing to public sentiment or to the cry of the Warhawks. A lot of people thought that if you could remove the Indian base in Canada, then you wouldn't have the frontier issues, and if in fact they are supplying or inciting resistance amongst the natives, then that makes sense. Madison and the Republicans also, though, knew that some sort of vigorous assertion of American rights could demonstrate the viability of American nationhood. And this is the point that I was trying to make at the beginning of the presentation, that the United States needs to sort of demonstrate to the rest of the world that this young nation can succeed and will succeed. Okay, and the vote for the War of 1812 is both partisan and based on sectionalism. As you can see, the South and the West were more in favor of war. They are Jeffersonian Republicans. There's a strong push for war also in Pennsylvania and Virginia. But in New England and the sort of Federalist mindset that existed there, there isn't really any support for the war. In fact, they're still pro-British, and they resented Republican sympathy with the French and therefore with Napoleon. So why war with Britain and not with France? Well, several things. First of all, there's the younger generation that I referenced before, and maybe they're tired of hearing the stories of their fathers and their war and their cause and so forth. It was just youthful ambition that happened to be in favor of a war with England more so than France. Here again are some photos of the Warhawks, younger photos of Calhoun and Clay this time. There's sort of a traditional Republican love for France, and keep in mind that James Madison, who was one of the authors of the Federalist Papers, and obviously advocated for a stronger central government at that point. However, after the Alien and Sedition Acts, he and Jefferson drafted the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, which promoted the concept of states' rights through nullification, and so there's certainly a change there. Also, the visibility of British impressment and arming of natives on the frontier, the Chesapeake Affair, is something that people can really, grab a hold of or hang a hat on. It's a concrete example of that. And this sort of lure of conquering British Canada, seeking new resources and continuing growth to the west. That's it for tonight. Thank you very much.